My name is Daniel Cole. I was 11 years old the summer my parents drove me to my grandfather's farm outside Millbrook, New York, and told me it was just for 2 weeks while they'd sorted some things out. I believed them. I was wrong. The drive took 3 hours. My mother, Renee, kept the radio low the whole way, humming along to nothing in particular, and my father, Gary, gripped the wheel with both hands like he was steering through fog even though the sky was clear. I remember the smell of the car, stale coffee and the pine air freshener clipped to the vent, because that smell would come back to me later, in moments I never expected, and each time it did, my stomach would drop the same way it dropped that day. When we pulled up the gravel drive, my grandfather, Walter Cole, was already standing on the porch in his flannel shirt, waiting, like he'd known we were coming before we called. He always seemed to know things before anyone told him. My mother hugged me too long at the car door. My father didn't get out at all. He just rolled down the window, said "Be good, buddy, we'll call you Sunday," and then they were gone, gravel dust rising behind the taillights until the road swallowed them whole. I stood there with my duffel bag and waited for the dust to settle. I didn't know it then, but that was the last time I would see either of them for 11 years. Sunday came. No call. My grandfather told me the phone lines were probably down, that these things happened out in the country, and I believed him because I wanted to. The next Sunday, no call. Then a month. Then it was September and I was still there, enrolled in Millbrook Elementary under my grandfather's address, wearing clothes my grandfather bought at the Kmart 40 minutes away because none of my things had ever been sent for. I asked my grandfather where my parents were more times than I can count, and every time, his face did the same thing, a kind of stillness, like a door quietly shutting, and he'd say, "They're working through some things, Danny. Give it time." I was a kid. I gave it time. I gave it years. What I did not know then, what I would not learn until I was 22 years old, sitting in a lawyer's office in Poughkeepsie with a manila folder in front of me and my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the pen, was that my parents had not vanished into some accident, some tragedy, some explainable silence. They had made a choice. A deliberate one. And that choice had a paper trail. Before I tell you what happened the day I finally understood why they never called back, and before I tell you what my grandfather knew that whole time and chose to carry alone rather than break my heart with it, tell me, what time is it where you're watching this from? Where are you watching from tonight? What's the weather like on your end? I ask because I still think about how far a story like this can travel, how many kitchens and cars and late-night couches it ends up in, carried by people who have their own version of a phone call that never came. My grandfather raised me. That's the short version. The long version has a smell to it, engine grease and hay, and the particular mustiness of a farmhouse kitchen where the coffee pot never fully emptied, because that smell is what safety felt like to me for 11 years. He taught me to drive a tractor before I could parallel park a car. He taught me how to fix a fence line, how to read weather in a cloud bank, how to sit with silence instead of filling it with noise. He never once, in 11 years, said a bad word about my parents in front of me. Not once. I used to think that was kindness. Later, I would understand it was something closer to restraint, the kind of restraint a man holds onto because he knows that if he lets go of it even a little, the truth underneath will come out sideways and it will hurt the one person he's trying to protect. I did not have a clean answer for why I stopped asking about my parents somewhere around age 14. Maybe it was easier not to ask. Maybe some part of me had already decided the answer would be worse than the silence. I finished high school in Millbrook. I went to SUNY New Paltz on a partial scholarship, majored in agricultural business because of course I did, because the farm was the only home I'd ever really known. I called my grandfather every Sunday. The day my parents never called, I called instead, like I was quietly correcting something in the universe that had been broken since I was 11. Then, in March of the year I turned 22, my grandfather had a stroke while repairing the north fence line. He was 78. He died 4 days later in Vassar Brothers Medical Center, and I was holding his hand when the machines went quiet. 2 weeks after the funeral, I got a call from a woman named Patricia Alvarez, an estate attorney with an office on Market Street in Poughkeepsie. She said my grandfather had left specific instructions. She said there were documents I needed to see. She said, gently, that some of what was in the file might be difficult to hear. I had no idea, sitting in my truck in that parking lot before the appointment, just how difficult it would actually be. To understand what I found in that lawyer's office, you have to understand what my family actually was before that summer, not the version I told myself as a kid trying to make sense of an unexplainable silence, but the real one. The one built on small cracks that had been forming long before I was ever sent away. My parents met in Newburgh in 1993. My mother, Renee, was the younger daughter of a schoolteacher, ambitious in a way that never quite found its footing. She'd started 3 different associate's degrees and finished none of them. My father, Gary, worked in commercial real estate, or at least he told people he did. The truth, which I only pieced together later, was that Gary spent most of the 2000s moving between jobs that never lasted more than 18 months, always with a story about why it wasn't his fault. A boss who was threatened by him. A company that restructured. A market that turned. My grandfather used to say, quietly, almost to himself, that Gary was a man who could talk his way into a room but never figure out how to stay in it. My grandfather, Walter, had sold 60 acres of his 140-acre farm back in 2001 to a neighboring dairy operation for $340,000. That sale sat in a money market account for years, untouched, meant, he told people at church, at the diner, at the feed store, to be split someday between his 2 grandchildren, me, and my cousin Melissa, my Aunt Carol's daughter, who lived 2 towns over and whom I barely knew growing up because Carol and my mother hadn't spoken since a falling out over their own mother's estate a decade earlier. That money, $340,000, sitting quiet in an account at Hudson Valley Federal Credit Union, is the actual center of this story. Everything else, the smell of the car, the porch, the 11 years of silence, orbits around that number. My father found out about the account in the spring before I was sent to the farm. I know this now because Patricia Alvarez showed me the paper trail, an actual paper trail, dated and notarized, the kind of thing you can't argue with no matter how much you want to. In April of that year, Gary had approached my grandfather twice asking for a loan, once for $40,000 to cover what he called a temporary cash flow problem from a failed flooring business he'd started with a man named Ron Petrosky, and once, 3 weeks later, for $75,000, no explanation given at all. My grandfather said no both times. He wasn't cruel about it. Patricia showed me a letter he'd kept, a copy of one he'd sent my father, where he wrote that he loved his son but that money had a way of rotting a family from the inside if you let it move the wrong direction too many times. That refusal, I believe, is the moment everything after it became inevitable. 3 weeks later, my parents drove me to the farm. I did not know, sitting in that truck as an 11-year-old, that my father had already met twice with a divorce attorney in White Plains, not because he and my mother were separating, but because the attorney, a man named Frank Delgado, had advised him on something else entirely, how a minor child living full-time with a grandparent could, under certain New York guardianship provisions, affect how an estate got structured if something happened to that grandparent later, and how, separately, removing themselves from active day-to-day parenting responsibilities might free up my mother to take a job offer she'd received in Charlotte, North Carolina, a job that came from a company owned by her college boyfriend, a man named Steve Halloran, whom she had reconnected with on Facebook that January. I want to say that clearly, because it took me years to say it clearly myself. My parents did not drop me off at my grandfather's farm because of some crisis, some unavoidable hardship, some grief they couldn't explain to a child. They dropped me off because it was convenient. My mother wanted a fresh start with a man she'd reconnected with online. My father wanted distance from a son who reminded him, every day, of a life he felt trapped inside. And my grandfather's refusal to hand over $115,000 combined between 2 loans gave them both, in some ugly, unspoken way, permission to walk away clean, because now, in their minds, I was being taken care of. Someone else's responsibility. Someone else's cost. They moved to Charlotte 4 months after dropping me off. I found this out from Patricia too, a change of address filing, a new home purchased in September of that year for $210,000, a joint mortgage with my mother listed as a cosigner alongside Steve Halloran's business partner as guarantor. My father got a job at Halloran's company 2 months after that, a job he would later describe, on a LinkedIn profile I eventually found, as Director of Business Development. He held it for 6 years. Longer than anything he'd held before. Funny what a person can hold on to when there's nothing left behind them pulling them back. My grandfather knew all of this. Not immediately, it took him almost 2 years to piece it together, mostly from a phone call with my Aunt Carol, who'd heard it from a mutual friend in Newburgh, but he knew, and he chose not to tell an 11-year-old, then a 12-year-old, then a 13-year-old boy who still asked, every few months, if his parents had called. Instead, he did something else. Something I would not learn about until I was sitting in Patricia Alvarez's office holding a folder that had apparently been waiting for me, sealed, for nearly a decade. Patricia Alvarez's office smelled like printer toner and the particular staleness of central air that's been running too long. She was maybe 50, silver-streaked hair pulled back, the kind of calm, unhurried manner you develop after decades of delivering news that changes people's lives across a desk. She had a folder in front of her nearly 2 inches thick, tabbed with color-coded stickers, and before she opened it, she looked at me and said, "Daniel, I want you to know your grandfather loved you very much, and everything in here is proof of that. Some of it is going to be hard anyway." I said I understood. I didn't, not yet. The first document she slid across the desk was the account statement from Hudson Valley Federal Credit Union, the $340,000 from the land sale, except it wasn't $340,000 anymore. It was $612,450.18. My grandfather had never touched it. He'd let it sit, reinvested the interest, added to it modestly over the years from the farm's income, and structured it. This was the second document, a trust agreement dated the same month I was dropped off, June of that year, into an irrevocable trust with my name on it as sole primary beneficiary. Not split with Melissa. Not accessible to my parents. Mine, held in trust, to be released to me in full at age 25 or upon his death, whichever came first, administered by Patricia's firm. He had done this 3 weeks after I arrived at the farm. 3 weeks after watching 2 people put their 11-year-old in his truck and drive away. The third document in the folder was the one that undid me. It was a letter, handwritten, dated the following Christmas, my first Christmas at the farm. My grandfather had never given it to me. Patricia said his instructions were explicit. I was only to receive it after his death, alongside everything else. In it, he wrote that he'd learned some things about why you're really here that I'm not going to burden you with, not now, maybe not ever, because you're a child and children shouldn't have to carry their parents' choices. He wrote that he intended to make sure I never went without, that the land money was always meant for the grandchildren and now it would go where it was needed most, and that if I ever read this letter, it meant he was gone and I deserved to finally know the truth. In his own words, at whatever age I was ready to hear it. Patricia let me sit with that for a while before continuing. Then she opened the 4th section of the folder, and this was where I stopped being able to think of any of this as simply sad, and started understanding it as something closer to a wound still actively bleeding. 8 months before my grandfather's stroke, he had been contacted. This was documented in an email chain Patricia had printed and highlighted, by my father. Gary. After 11 years of no contact whatsoever. The email, dated the previous July, read in part that Gary had heard through a cousin that Walter's health was not what it used to be, and that he wanted to reconnect as a family and make sure everything with the farm and the estate was properly squared away for everyone, including Danny, obviously, but also fairly, for all of us. Attached to that email was a second document, a proposed amendment to my grandfather's will, drafted by an attorney my father had hired, not Patricia, a different firm entirely. One in White Plains that Patricia's investigator later confirmed was the same firm Frank Delgado had referred him to years earlier, that would have restructured the trust to distribute funds not solely to me, but split 3 ways between me, my parents, and Melissa's mother Carol, in recognition of family unity and shared history. My grandfather had not responded to that email for 6 weeks. When he finally did, Patricia showed me the reply, and I read it twice because I couldn't believe the restraint in it. He wrote, "Gary, I appreciate you reaching out. I've thought about what you sent for a long time. I'm not going to change anything. Danny is 21 years old now and he still doesn't know why you two left him with me, and I've never told him, because I thought it would break something in him that didn't need breaking. But I want you to understand that I know exactly why you're contacting me now, and it isn't about family unity. It's about money, and it's about timing, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to keep the peace. The land was always meant for Danny. That hasn't changed and it isn't going to." My father wrote back once more, 2 weeks later. That email was shorter and colder, and it's the one I keep coming back to even now. It said, "You've always favored him over your own son. This isn't over, Dad." 3 months after that exchange, Gary filed something in Dutchess County Sigget's court, a preliminary notice, Patricia explained, a kind of legal placeholder some attorneys use to signal an intent to contest a will or trust later, designed to create friction and delay before an estate even settles. He'd filed it quietly, without telling my grandfather, without telling me, banking, it seemed, on the idea that an 80-year-old man's estate would eventually change hands whether Walter liked it or not. My grandfather had the stroke 5 months after that filing. I sat in Patricia's office and asked her the only question I had left in me at that point: did he know? At the end. Did he know Dad was already trying to take it? Patricia looked at me for a long moment before she answered, and when she did, her voice had gone very quiet. "Yes, Daniel. He knew. And 2 weeks before he died, he called me and made one more change to the trust. I think you need to see that one for yourself." Patricia turned to the last tab section in the folder, a yellow sticker marked Amendment, Final. She slid it across slowly, like she wanted to give me one more second before I had to read it. It was dated February 3rd, 11 days before my grandfather's stroke. It was short, barely 2 pages, but every line of it landed like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading out long after the splash. The amendment did 3 things. First, it formally closed off any possibility of the trust ever being redirected, restructured, or contested by naming a no-contest clause with teeth. Any beneficiary or family member who filed a legal challenge to the trust would automatically forfeit any claim to any portion of the estate, full stop, no exceptions. Second, it added a memorandum, not legally binding on its own, Patricia explained, but intended, in my grandfather's words as written in the document, to be read into the record if anyone ever asks why I did what I did. And third, it directed Patricia's firm to compile a complete file, every email, every court filing, every financial record connected to Gary's attempt to alter the trust, and hold it, sealed, to be given to me only after his death, so that Danny has the full truth in his own hands, from me, and never has to hear a version of it filtered through anyone who benefits from him not knowing. The memorandum itself was the hardest part to read. My grandfather had dictated it to Patricia over the phone, and she'd typed it as he spoke, then read it back to him for approval before he signed. In it, he described watching an 11-year-old boy stand in his driveway with a duffel bag, waiting for a phone call that never came. He described the years of watching me ask fewer and fewer questions about my parents until, by 14, I'd stopped asking altogether, and how that silence, he wrote, broke something in me more than any single betrayal Gary and Renee ever did, because I watched a child teach himself not to hope, and there is no fixing that kind of damage, only building something new next to it. He wrote that he'd made mistakes protecting me from the truth for too long, that maybe I deserved to know sooner, but that every time he considered telling me, he pictured me at 11, at 12, at 13, and couldn't bring himself to hand a child a fact that heavy. He wrote that the money was never about punishing Gary and Renee. It was about making sure that the one person who'd actually shown up, who'd actually stayed, never had to wonder again whether he mattered enough to someone. I put the paper down because my hands weren't steady enough to hold it anymore. Patricia gave me water and time and then, gently, told me there was one more thing I needed to know, something that hadn't come from the estate documents at all, but from her own investigator, a retired detective named Ruth Bianchi whom the firm sometimes used for asset searches and due diligence on contested estates. When Gary's court filing came in 3 months after his email exchange with my grandfather, Patricia, anticipating exactly this kind of conflict, she admitted, because she'd seen it before in families circling money near the end of a patriarch's life, had asked Ruth to quietly look into my father's financial situation, to understand what was actually driving the sudden reconnection after 11 years of silence. What Ruth found was this: Gary had been terminated from Halloran's company 14 months earlier, not resigned, not restructured, terminated, following what an internal HR complaint, obtained through a records request Ruth had access to via a contact at the company, described as misappropriation of client entertainment funds, roughly $22,000 routed through fraudulent expense reports over an 18-month period. He had not told my mother the real reason. He'd told her, and told Melissa's family, and told everyone else, that he'd been laid off in a restructuring. He'd spent the next year unable to find comparable work, burning through savings, and had taken out a home equity line of credit against the Charlotte house, the same house my mother had co-signed for back when the money and the future had still seemed limitless, for $95,000, most of which was already gone. My mother, meanwhile, had separated from Steve Halloran's company 2 years earlier, not fired, but sidelined after Halloran's own divorce made things awkward, and had been working part-time at a dental office in Charlotte making $19 an hour. They were drowning. Quietly, invisibly, the way people drown when they've spent 2 decades performing a version of stability they never actually had. And somewhere in that drowning, my father had remembered that his own father was old, and that there was over $500,000 sitting in an account with his son's name on it, and he had decided, deliberately, with a lawyer, with a court filing, with a strategy, that this was worth reaching for. I sat in that office for a long time after Patricia stopped talking. I did not cry, which surprised me. What I felt instead was something colder and more clarifying than grief, a kind of stillness, the same stillness I remembered on my grandfather's face every time I used to ask about my parents as a kid. I understood that stillness now. It wasn't sadness. It was the moment a person decides, quietly and permanently, exactly how much more they're going to allow. What happens now? I asked Patricia, with the court filing. Is he still trying? Patricia nodded slowly. There's a preliminary hearing in 6 weeks, Daniel. Your father's attorney filed a formal objection to the trust distribution 2 days after your grandfather passed. I think it's time we talked about how you want to handle it. I want to be honest about what I felt sitting across from Patricia that afternoon, because I think it matters more than anything I did afterward. I did not feel rage, or at least not the kind you'd expect from a movie version of this story. What I felt was a kind of terrible clarity, the sort that arrives after you've spent years not letting yourself ask a question, and the answer finally comes anyway, all at once, whether you're ready or not. I did not want to scream at my father. I did not want to drive to Charlotte and bang on a door. What I wanted, more than anything, was for the truth to exist somewhere official, permanent, undeniable, a record that could never again be smoothed over by a phone call or a birthday card or some rehearsed apology 20 years too late. So I told Patricia I wanted to fight the objection the right way. Not with anger. With paper. Over the next 5 weeks, I learned more about estate law, surrogate court procedure, and forensic accounting than I ever expected to know in my life. Patricia walked me through it patiently, piece by piece. My father's objection, filed by his attorney, a man named Douglas Reyes, out of the White Plains firm, argued that Walter Cole had been of diminished mental capacity in the final year of his life, and that the February 3rd Amendment, made just 11 days before the stroke, should be considered legally invalid, the product of an elderly man being unduly influenced by his estate attorney. It was, Patricia said flatly, the single most common tactic used to contest a late-stage estate change, and also one of the easiest to disprove when the record didn't support it. And the record did not support it. Patricia obtained my grandfather's full medical file from Vassar Brothers, along with records from Dr. Elaine Frost, his primary care physician of 19 years, showing a cognitive assessment performed just 6 weeks before the amendment, routine, part of an annual physical, that scored him at 29 out of 30 on a standard mental status exam, no signs of decline. She subpoenaed the phone records from the day the amendment was signed, showing a 14-minute call between my grandfather and Patricia's office before the document was even drafted, followed 3 days later by a second call confirming the language, followed by an in-person signing at the farmhouse itself, witnessed not just by Patricia but by a notary named Carla Whitfield and, separately, by my grandfather's longtime neighbor and friend, a retired postal worker named Hank Delacroix, who Patricia arranged to have present specifically to establish an independent, disinterested witness with no financial stake in the outcome. Hank gave a sworn statement I read twice because of how plainly it was written. He said Walter had made him coffee that morning, complained about the price of diesel, asked about Hank's granddaughter's soccer season, and then sat down at the kitchen table and read through the amendment out loud, line by line, before signing it, saying, Hank's exact words in the statement, "I want this done right so nobody can say I didn't know what I was doing." That single sentence, spoken to a neighbor over coffee with no lawyer prompting him, did more to dismantle Douglas Reyes's diminished capacity argument than almost anything else in the file. Patricia also brought in a forensic document examiner, a woman named Sandra Kowalski, who confirmed the signature on the amendment matched, with a documented 98% confidence interval, 17 other signatures from my grandfather spanning the prior 3 years, farm equipment receipts, church donation records, a signed birthday card he'd mailed me the year before, the ordinary paper trail of an ordinary life, all of it consistent, none of it showing the tremor or irregularity that sometimes accompanies genuine cognitive decline. Then there was the financial piece, which Patricia said would ultimately matter more to the judge than anything emotional. Ruth Bianchi's investigation into my father's finances, the termination from Halloran's company, the $22,000 in misappropriated expenses, the $95,000 home equity line, the fact that he'd told my mother and everyone else a different story about why he'd lost his job, was compiled into a formal report and submitted as evidence of motive. Patricia was careful to explain this wasn't strictly necessary to defeat a diminished capacity claim, but it mattered for a different reason. It established, on the record, exactly why my father had reappeared after 11 years of silence, at precisely the moment his own finances had collapsed and his father's estate had become, in Patricia's words, the only asset left within reach. I met with a detective too, though not in the way you might expect. This wasn't a criminal case, not yet, but Patricia recommended I speak with Detective Marcus Wheeler, out of the Dutchess County Sheriff's Financial Crimes Unit, mostly as a precaution, in case my father's attorney tried anything more aggressive once the paper trail against him became clear. Wheeler was measured, unhurried, the kind of man who'd clearly sat across from 100 families exactly like mine. He told me something I've held on to since: money doesn't create character, Daniel. It just removes the excuse people use to hide it. By the 5th week, Patricia had built a file nearly as thick as the one my grandfather had left me: sworn statements, medical records, phone logs, signature analysis, financial disclosures, everything organized, tabbed, dated, undeniable. Douglas Reyes requested a settlement conference before the hearing even happened, which Patricia said was, in itself, a tell. They know they're going to lose, she told me. The question now is just how much dignity your father wants to lose along with it. I told her I didn't care about his dignity. I cared about one thing only, that whatever happened next happened in a room with witnesses, on the record, where no one could ever again tell a different version of the story than the one that actually occurred. 6 weeks after that meeting, we were in Dutchess County Circuit's court. The courtroom in Poughkeepsie was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled, fluorescent lit, the kind of room that has seen 1,000 quiet tragedies and doesn't perform any drama about them. I sat beside Patricia at a table on the right. My father sat 2 tables over, in a gray suit that looked a size too big for him now, next to Douglas Reyes. My mother sat behind him in the gallery, in a navy dress, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. I hadn't seen either of them in 11 years. My father looked older than I expected, and smaller, somehow, than the version of him I'd built up in my head across a decade of silence. Judge Miriam Osei called the proceeding to order at 9:14 in the morning. There is no way to make a courtroom feel like anything other than what it is: slow, procedural, stripped of the emotional shortcuts that make confrontation easier in movies. But that slowness is exactly what made it land the way it did. Douglas Reyes spoke first, laying out the diminished capacity argument the way Patricia had predicted, careful and clinical, describing my grandfather as an elderly man in declining health, isolated on a rural property, susceptible to influence from the very professionals entrusted to protect him. Judge Osei let him finish, then turned to Patricia. Ms. Alvarez, your response. Patricia didn't raise her voice. She never did, the whole hearing. She simply began laying out the record, one piece at a time, the way you'd set stones across a river until there was a path where none had existed a moment before. The cognitive assessment. The phone logs. Sandra Kowalski's signature analysis. And then, finally, Hank Delacroix. Hank was called to the stand. He wore a collared shirt that still had the fold creases from the store, and he sat with his hands on his knees like a man unused to being looked at by strangers. Patricia asked him to describe the morning of February 3rd. Walter made coffee, Hank said. We talked about the Yankees bullpen, mostly. Then he sat down and read that whole document out loud before he signed it. Every line. I remember because I told him he didn't need to read it to me, and he said, I want this done right so nobody can say I didn't know what I was doing. I watched my father's jaw tighten when Hank said that. It was the first time all morning he'd shown anything on his face at all. Douglas Reyes tried, on cross-examination, to suggest Hank had been selected specifically because of his friendship with my grandfather, implying bias. Hank just looked at him and said, plainly, I've known Walter Cole for 31 years. I don't know his grandson's lawyer from a stranger on the street. I was there because he asked me to be, and I told the truth same as I'd tell it to anybody. Then came Ruth Bianchi's financial report. Patricia entered it into evidence methodically, the termination from Halloran's company, the $22,000 in misappropriated expense claims, the fact that my father had told my mother, and everyone else, that he'd been laid off. When Patricia read the termination letter's language aloud, misappropriation of client entertainment funds totaling approximately $22,000 over an 18-month period, I heard my mother, behind me in the gallery, make a small sound, almost a gasp, quickly swallowed. I understood then that she hadn't known either. Whatever else she was guilty of, this particular piece of it had been kept from her too. Judge Osei asked my father directly, at one point, why he had waited 11 years to reach out to his father, and why that outreach had come specifically 8 months before Walter's death, 6 weeks after his own termination. My father answered carefully, the way a man answers when he's been coached. I wanted to reconcile with my father before it was too late. That's all. And the timing, Judge Osei said, relative to your termination from Halloran Group. Coincidence? There was a long pause. I don't see how my employment history is relevant to whether my father was of sound mind. It's relevant, Judge Osei said, to motive, Mr. Cole. And motive is very much on trial today, whether your counsel intended it to be or not. That was the moment the room shifted. I felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Patricia stood then and asked if she could read one final piece of evidence into the record, my grandfather's memorandum, the one dictated over the phone 2 weeks before his death. Judge Osei allowed it. Patricia read it in full, calm and unhurried, every word landing in that quiet room like something being set down gently after being carried too long. When she reached the line about watching an 11-year-old stand in a driveway with a duffel bag, waiting for a phone call that never came, I heard my mother start to cry behind me, quietly, into her hand. My father did not look at me once during the reading. Not once. He looked at the table in front of him, at his own folded hands, and I realized somewhere in that silence that this stillness, this refusal to meet my eyes even now, was the truest thing he'd shown me all morning. When Patricia finished, Judge Osei set the memorandum down and looked directly at my father. "Mr. Cole, I've heard nothing today, nothing, that supports diminished capacity. What I've heard is a father who documented, with remarkable care, exactly why he made the choice he made, and a son who is contesting that choice at the precise moment his own finances required it. I'm not in the business of guessing motive lightly, but the record here speaks for itself." She called a 15-minute recess before issuing her ruling. I sat at that table with Patricia's hand briefly resting on my shoulder, and for the first time since walking into that courtroom, I let myself breathe. Judge Osei returned after 17 minutes, not 15, and I remember noticing the extra 2 minutes the way you notice small, meaningless details in moments too large to fully absorb. She read her ruling standing, which Patricia told me afterward was unusual, and it took less than 3 minutes to say, though its consequences would take years to fully play out. She found no evidence of diminished capacity. She found the February 3rd amendment valid in its entirety, properly witnessed, properly notarized, consistent with 17 prior signatures, executed by a man who had scored 29 out of 30 on a cognitive assessment 6 weeks earlier and who had, in the words of an independent witness, insisted on reading the document aloud specifically so no one could later claim he hadn't understood it. She dismissed my father's objection with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. And then, because the trust's no contest clause was airtight and my father's attorney had been warned about it explicitly in writing before filing, she ruled that Gary Cole had formally forfeited any claim, present or future, to any portion of Walter Cole's estate, not just the $612,450.18 trust, but the farmhouse itself, the remaining 80 acres, and the farm equipment, all of which had been separately willed to me as well. The total value of what my father lost that morning, by Patricia's later calculation, came to just under $940,000. That wasn't the only cost. Judge Osei, in a move Patricia said she'd rarely seen a Sagat's court judge take, referred the matter of the misappropriated Halloran Group funds, the $22,000 uncovered in Ruth Bianchi's report, which had surfaced publicly now as part of the court record, to the Dutchess County District Attorney's Office for review, noting that while it fell outside her jurisdiction, a sworn financial disclosure containing evidence of possible fraud couldn't simply be ignored once entered into open court. 6 months later, I learned through Patricia that Halloran Group's corporate counsel in Charlotte had reopened an internal investigation using the court record as a starting point, and that my father had ultimately agreed to a restitution settlement of $22,000 plus interest to avoid a formal fraud complaint being filed in North Carolina, a settlement that, combined with the mounting home equity debt, effectively wiped out what little financial cushion remained for him and my mother. Douglas Reyes's firm, I heard later through Patricia's professional circle, quietly declined to take on any further estate contest work from my father, citing the optics of the case. Whether that was fully true or a polite way of severing a relationship with a client who'd become a liability, I never found out, and honestly, I stopped caring to ask. My mother did not lose anything in the legal sense, she had never been a party to the trust or the objection, but she lost something else that morning, sitting in that gallery hearing, for the first time, the actual reason my father had lost his job, the actual reason they'd moved to Charlotte with a co-signed mortgage and a man named Steve Halloran, the actual contents of a memorandum describing an 11-year-old boy she'd driven away and never called. She approached me in the hallway afterward, alone, my father nowhere in sight. She looked smaller than I remembered her being, smaller than the woman who'd hummed along to the radio the whole drive to the farm. "Danny," she said, and her voice cracked on the single syllable of my name. "I didn't know. About the money. About what he told people. I want you to know I didn't know." I looked at her for a long moment. I did not feel cruelty toward her, not exactly, but I did not feel the reflexive forgiveness I might have offered as a child either. "You knew enough," I said. "You knew you left me there and you didn't call. That part was never a secret you needed anyone else to explain to you." She didn't have an answer for that. "I don't think there is one." I left the courthouse that day and drove straight back to the farm, not the version I'd built up in my head as some looming inheritance, but the actual physical place, the porch, the gravel drive, the north fence line my grandfather had been repairing when the stroke took him. I sat on the porch steps until it got dark, and I did not feel triumphant, which surprised me. I felt, mostly, tired, in the particular way you feel tired after carrying something heavy for so long that your body has to relearn what it feels like to set it down. Patricia called 2 days later to walk me through the formal transfer process, the trust disbursement, the deed transfer for the farm, the paperwork that would, over the following weeks, make everything my grandfather had protected for 11 years officially, permanently, undeniably mine. Somewhere in that call, almost as an aside, she mentioned that her office had received a letter from my father, sent to the firm rather than to me directly, that he'd asked her to pass along. I told her I'd read it eventually, but not yet. It sat unopened on my kitchen table for 6 weeks before I finally opened it. The letter, when I finally opened it, was 3 paragraphs long, handwritten, the penmanship shakier than I remembered from the few birthday cards he'd sent in the earliest years before even those stopped. He wrote that he was sorry, in the vague way people are sorry when they've run out of better excuses. He wrote that he'd made mistakes he couldn't undo, that he hoped someday I'd understand the pressure he'd been under, that family was still family no matter what a courtroom decided. He did not mention the $22,000. He did not mention Steve Halloran, or Frank Delgado, or the 2 loan requests my grandfather had refused 11 years earlier. He asked, at the very end, almost casually, whether I'd consider helping out a little, now that things had settled, given everything that had happened with his job. I read it twice. Then I folded it back along its original creases, put it in a drawer in the farmhouse kitchen, the same drawer where my grandfather had kept spare fuses and rubber bands and other small useless things he never threw away, and I did not respond. I still haven't. I don't know if I ever will, and for the first time in my life, I've let myself sit with not knowing instead of forcing an answer just to relieve the discomfort of the question. That first year on the farm alone was quieter than I expected grief to be. I'd braced myself for something dramatic to collapse, or rage, or some cinematic unraveling, but what actually came was smaller and slower than that. I finished my degree that spring, drove back and forth to New Paltz 3 days a week, came home each evening to feed the small herd of cattle my grandfather had kept mostly out of habit more than profit. I fixed the north fence line myself, the one he'd been working on when the stroke happened, using the same tools, in the same spot, and I remember standing there afterward with dirt on my hands thinking that this, more than any legal ruling, was the thing that actually felt like closure. Not a judge's voice. A finished fence. I didn't talk to a therapist until almost a year later, and only because Hank Delacroix's granddaughter, the soccer player, was in the same graduate program as a counselor named Dr. Priya Nair who specialized in family estrangement, and Hank mentioned it to me one afternoon over coffee like it was nothing, the way he mentioned everything. I went, mostly out of curiosity, expecting to talk about my parents. Instead, most of what I ended up talking about was my grandfather, the years of silence he kept, the choice he made not to tell me the truth as a child, whether that silence had been protection or its own kind of quiet harm. Dr. Nair never gave me a clean answer to that question, and I've come to appreciate that she didn't try. Some things aren't resolvable into a single neat conclusion. My grandfather protected me and, in protecting me, also let me spend years wondering what was wrong with me that my own parents never called. Both of those things are true. I don't think I need to choose which one cancels out the other. I did not have a clean answer either, for what I felt about my mother's hallway apology, or my father's letter sitting folded in that kitchen drawer. Some days I felt nothing at all when I thought of them, a kind of flat, distant calm, like reading about strangers. Other days, usually without warning, usually triggered by something small and stupid, like the smell of stale coffee in a gas station, or pine air freshener in someone else's car, I'd feel 11 years old again, standing in a gravel driveway, watching dust settle over a road that had swallowed a pair of tail lights whole. I don't think that feeling ever fully goes away. I've stopped expecting it to. 2 years after the ruling, I ran into Melissa, my cousin, Carol's daughter, the one I'd barely known growing up because of a falling out that predated both of us, at a wedding in Newburgh neither of us had particularly wanted to attend. We talked for almost 2 hours, mostly about our grandparents, about how strange it was that money and silence had kept two cousins strangers for most of their lives over disputes that had nothing to do with either of us directly. We've stayed in touch since. She's the closest thing to family I actively choose now, rather than family I was simply born into and expected to accept without question. The farm is doing well. I expanded the cattle operation modestly, using part of the trust to modernize equipment my grandfather had kept running on stubbornness and duct tape for longer than he should have. I still make coffee the way he did, too strong, in a percolator older than I am. I still sit on that porch some evenings and think about the difference between the family you're given and the family that actually shows up. If there's one thing I'd say to anyone listening to this who's carrying their own version of a phone call that never came, it's this: forgiveness, if it ever comes, has to be something you choose for your own peace, not something you owe simply because the other person shares your blood. But access is real access, back into your life, your time, your trust, that has to be earned. Slowly. Deliberately. The same way my grandfather earned mine, one quiet Sunday phone call at a time, for 11 straight years, without ever once asking me to explain why I was calling him instead of the people who were supposed to call me. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a farmhouse in late autumn, once the harvest is in and the animals are fed and there's nothing left to do but wait for winter, and I've come to understand that quiet is the closest thing I have to peace. It isn't happiness, exactly. It's steadier than that. It's the feeling of a person who has stopped waiting for an explanation that was never going to come on its own, and instead built one for himself, piece by piece, out of court documents and sworn statements and a dead man's careful handwriting. I think about my grandfather constantly, more now than in the years right after he died. Not in the dramatic way grief is sometimes portrayed, not collapsing over old photographs, not breaking down at the sound of his name, but in small, specific, almost mundane ways. I think about him every time I make coffee too strong. I think about him every time I catch myself going quiet instead of saying something I haven't fully thought through yet, because that was his way, and somewhere along the 11 years he raised me, it became mine too. I think about the fact that a man in his 70s, recovering from the shock of learning his own son had tried to manipulate his estate, chose not to respond with anger, or confrontation, or even a phone call demanding an explanation. He chose paperwork. He chose patience. He chose to build something so airtight that by the time I finally needed it, there would be nothing left to argue about. I used to think that was simply his personality, quiet, methodical, a man who fixed fences instead of talking about his feelings. Now I understand it as something closer to a philosophy, one I didn't fully absorb until I needed to live by it myself, that the most powerful response to betrayal isn't rage. It's documentation. It's patience. It's making sure that when the truth finally does come out, it comes out so clearly, so completely, that no one can ever again talk their way around it. I don't know if my father has fully reckoned with what he lost. I suspect he hasn't, not really. People like him tend to reframe consequences as bad luck, as other people's cruelty, rather than the direct, traceable result of choices they made with their eyes open. I heard, secondhand, through Melissa, that he and my mother are still in Charlotte, still married, still scraping by on far less than they used to have. I don't feel satisfaction hearing that. I thought I might, once, in the angrier years. Mostly now I just feel the particular emptiness of realizing that even total legal vindication doesn't make someone into the parent you needed them to be 20 years ago. The ruling gave me the truth and it gave me the farm. It didn't give me back the version of childhood where someone called on Sundays. V.e. me permission to stop auditioning for my parents' love. For years, some quiet part of me had kept performing, good grades, no trouble, never asking too many hard questions, as if being good enough might eventually earn a phone call. Sitting in that courtroom, hearing my grandfather's memorandum read aloud, Hearing him name exactly what had been done to me without flinching from the truth of it, was the first time in my life someone had said, plainly and permanently, on the record, "This happened, it was wrong, and you did nothing to deserve it." I didn't know how much I needed to hear that until I finally did. I still keep my father's letter in that kitchen drawer. I take it out sometimes, read it again, and put it back. I'm not protecting some fantasy that I'll eventually respond and everything will resolve itself neatly. I think I keep it because it's proof that I have a choice now that I never had as a child. As an 11-year-old standing in a gravel driveway, I had no say in whether my parents drove away. As a 22-year-old sitting at that kitchen table, I have complete say in whether I ever let them back in, on what terms, at what pace, if at all. That difference between having no choice and having every choice is, I think, the entire distance between who I was that summer and who I am now. So I'll leave you with the same question I've had to sit with myself, because I think it's a fair one, and I don't think there's a single right answer to it, only the one that's true for you. If the people who were supposed to show up for you never did, and then, years later, showed up only once there was something in it for them, how much of your life, your trust, your peace, would you let them back into? Not out of cruelty. Not out of revenge. Just out of an honest reckoning with what access actually has to be earned, and what doesn't. I don't know your answer. I'm not sure I fully know mine, some days. But I know it's mine to decide now, and for 11 years, that wasn't true. That, more than the farm, more than the money, more than the ruling itself, is what I actually got back. Before I let you go tonight, I want to step outside the story for a moment and speak directly, one more time, the way I did earlier when I asked where you were watching from, what the weather looked like on your end, how far a story like this might actually travel once it leaves my hands and lands in yours. I think about that a lot, how many kitchens, how many late-night car rides, how many quiet living rooms after everyone else has gone to bed, a story like this ends up sitting in. I think about the fact that some of you listening right now are carrying your own version of a driveway, your own version of a phone call that never came, your own version of a family member who only reappeared once there was something to gain. If that's you, I hope some part of tonight felt less lonely. I want to thank you, sincerely, for spending this time with Daniel's story. Whether you found it on a recommendation, or you've been following along for a while now, or you stumbled onto it at 2 in the morning unable to sleep, I'm grateful you stayed until the end. And I want to be completely clear with you about something important. Everything in this video is fictional, made only for entertainment and reflection. Daniel Cole is not a real person. Walter Cole, Gary and Renee Cole, Patricia Alvarez, Detective Marcus Wheeler, Hank Delacroix, Melissa, Steve Halloran, Douglas Reyes, Judge Miriam Osei, none of these people exist. The farm outside Millbrook, the courtroom in Poughkeepsie, the trust, the $612,450.18, the misappropriated $22,000, the home equity line, all of it, invented, start to finish, for the purpose of telling a story about betrayal, patience, and what it means to finally hold your own truth in your own hands. Any resemblance to real people, real families, or real events is entirely coincidental. This is dramatized fiction, nothing more, and nothing less. But I'll say this, and I mean it as sincerely as I can, even though the names and dates and dollar amounts in this particular story were invented, the shape of it, the long silence, the sudden reappearance once money is at stake, the years spent quietly wondering what you did wrong to deserve being left behind, that shape is real for a lot of people. I hear from viewers constantly who tell me some version of this story happened to them, not with a farm in New York, not with a trust or a courtroom, but in their own families, their own quiet betrayals, their own version of waiting for a call that never came. If that's you, I want you to hear one thing clearly before you go: whatever happened to you as a child was not something you earned. Children don't cause the choices adults make about convenience, or money, or their own second chances. If someone left you somewhere, physically or emotionally, and dressed it up afterward as necessity, that was never a reflection of your worth. It was a reflection of theirs. And if, like Daniel, you ever find yourself standing at the other end of that story, older now, with more information than you had as a child, finally able to see clearly what happened and why, I hope you give yourself permission to do what he eventually did. Not revenge. Not cruelty. Just clarity. Just the quiet, deliberate work of finding out what's true, and then deciding, calmly and on your own terms, exactly how much access anyone gets to the rest of your life. Forgiveness, if it ever comes, is yours to give or withhold, and no one else gets a vote in that decision. But access is different. Access has to be earned, slowly, consistently, the way trust always has to be earned, one honest Sunday at a time. Nobody is entitled to your peace just because they share your blood, and nobody gets to skip the years of showing up simply because they finally noticed you had something worth reaching for. That's the whole of it, really. A story about a boy left in a driveway who grew into a man who got to decide, for the first time in his life, what happens next. I hope wherever you're watching this from tonight, whatever the weather looks like outside your window, however late it's gotten, however far this story has traveled to reach you, you carry a little bit of that same clarity with you. The kind that doesn't need anyone else's permission. The kind that's just quietly, finally, yours. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves, and take care of the people who actually show up.